So let me first introduce our keynote speaker, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy, Mr. Kirk Donnelly. Prior to coming back to Washington, D.C., Mr. Donnelly served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade, Serbia. His other assignments include the U.S. mission to NATO, Afghanistan, Turkey, Hungary, Russia, Germany, the National Security Council, Director of the State Department Office for International Religious Freedom, and Director for Central Asian Affairs. So as you can see from this really impressive biography, Mr. Donnelly is really a specialist on our region and on the way this region can be integrated in its regional framework, both toward Asia and toward Europe. So please join me in welcoming our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at George Washington University and to participate in this important conversation about soft infrastructure in Central Asia. I'd like to thank GW's Elliott School and the International Tax and Investment Center, as well as Eric Cohen, Marlena L'Oreal, Daniel Witt, and James Grant for making this event possible. This event is important because it asks us to think hard about how a key region in the world can achieve its political, economic, and social potential. It's also important to me personally because of my experience working on Central Asia issues. I was, as pointed out, the director of the State Department Central Asia office. This was some years ago. And then worked for 2 years as the director for Central Asia at the National Security Council in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. That was a time, I think fair to say, when I was at the National Security Council, of increased focus on Central Asia, primarily because of Afghanistan. Our interests were there. But it was also a time of considerable optimism about Central Asia. We had a democratic change of government in Kyrgyzstan during that time. We saw some openings in Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan was developing rapidly. But one of the things that was always in the conversation was this idea of the new Silk Road. It was a really captivating idea, a very interesting idea. And it really recognized the tremendous potential, just because of Central Asia's geography, tremendous potential that resided in Central Asia for it to become a trade and transportation hub between East and West. But that particular vision never really became a reality. And it wasn't really for the lack of hard infrastructure. I mean, those of us who have traveled a lot in Central Asia, you understand that the infrastructure there isn't great. But the infrastructure isn't terrible either. And I think the evidence of that is when the time that I was at the NSC was during the surge in Afghanistan. And we used Central Asia as one of the primary transportation routes for supplying more than 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan. If you ever saw the list of things that we transported through Central Asia to Afghanistan, it is remarkable what a logistical effort that was. And this was done primarily with the airports and roads and rail lines that were available to us at the time. So really, to do that, it didn't require a whole lot of extra hard infrastructure. The failure of that concept of the New Silk Road was because of soft infrastructure. Poor governance, corruption, onerous government intervention and regulation, and maybe most important of all, dysfunctional borders. Crossing borders in Central Asia at that time was a treacherous, difficult, very, very time-consuming task. And it was never really clear what you were going to face if you were a truck driver or moving a cargo of goods on a train. So I'm pleased that you're addressing the challenge of Central Asia's soft infrastructure. Today I'd like to focus on energy. That's my job at the State Department now, is energy diplomacy. Look at energy and how soft infrastructure can enhance energy security and thereby contribute to energy security and political sovereignty in Central Asia. As proof of concept, I will offer a short history of the American experience of a competitive energy sector, and then briefly characterize how I think this experience could be replicated in Central Asia. Energy security depends on diversification of energy supplies by country of origin, by path of delivery, fuel types, and even renewables. But energy security can't be achieved in a day. The infrastructure that underpins the diversification of energy supplies, exploration, development of oil and gas resources, construction of power plants, laying of pipelines, transmission lines, development of solar farms, and all sorts of other investments, these require a tremendous amount of capital to be invested to accomplish its goals. And for many countries, the ability to make these projects a reality depends on an ability to attract long-term investment and on transparent terms that reflect an equitable distribution of risk and return. From the perspective of the private sector, the ingredients of this attraction are not exotic, they're pretty straightforward. A country will tend to scare away potential energy sector investments if their economies are dominated by monopolies, if they offer prejudicial or arbitrary imposed tax regimes, or if that sector is otherwise poorly governed. And certainly we've seen a lot of this in Central Asia since their independence from the Soviet Union. For governments, the situation is similarly straightforward. No government has unlimited resources. When it comes to public spending, often there is too little to go around. Effective soft infrastructure, by encouraging competitive and private sector participation, can enable a country to achieve its energy security goals at a minimal cost. Open and transparent competition gets a country to its goals most efficiently, and thereby frees up resources to be invested elsewhere. As I said earlier, there's nothing exotic here, but the consequences of incorporating these ingredients can be transformative. In the context of energy security and soft infrastructure, consider the American experience. Over the last 15 years, the United States has gone through an energy transformation. For nearly 30 years, U.S. oil and gas production had been in decline. Oil production fell from a height of 9.6 million barrels a day in 1970 to just 5 million barrels in 2008. But today, production has reached 12.5 million barrels a day. By 2020, we expect that to reach over 13 million barrels a day. And that means exports. The U.S. is an oil exporting country of 750,000 barrels a day. This is a huge change. It's the same for natural gas. In 1973, U.S. gas production peaked at 614 billion cubic meters per year. By 1983, it had fallen to 455 billion cubic meters per year. Next year, domestic gas production in the United States is projected to rise to 96 billion cubic meters per year. 150 billion cubic meters of that will be for export. Today, the U.S. is the largest oil and gas producer in the world and will be a net exporter of gas and oil next year. By 2025, the U.S. will be the largest LNG exporter in the world. These are enormous changes. They didn't come by accident. They came because of carefully thought out policies to encourage this kind of change. Nearly 100 Fortune 500 companies have pledged to source 100% of their energy consumption from renewables. This is another important development in the United States energy mix. They're making these commitments and investments because it is profitable for them to do so, not because they're directed by a government to do anything else to do it. This is because they can make money at renewables. And these sectors are generating huge numbers of jobs in the United States. It really is remarkable when you think of the impact on the U.S. economy in renewables. So how did this happen? It happened because investors, entrepreneurs, engineers, and others seized the opportunity to compete for market share and get a high return on their investments. These developments in the oil and gas sector have significantly enhanced America's economy, our economic security, and our energy security. We're in a stronger position, perhaps than ever before, to respond to a disruption in energy imports. I remind you of the attack on the Saudi facilities not too long ago. The Saudis are everyone understands, the swing producers. Well, 5 million barrels a day was taken out of production. The United States actually served the function of the swing producer in the international energy markets at that time. I mean, think about that, what an enormous change that is. So let me now turn to how this pattern can play out in Central Asia. As happened in the United States, Central Asian countries can grow their energy production and enhance their energy security by developing and maintaining attractive investment environments. Like the United States, Central Asian countries have enormous energy resource potential. Kazakhstan, with its wind potential, could become a major consumer and exporter of clean energy. With technical support from USAID, Kazakhstan auctioned nearly 1,000 megawatts of clean energy capacity in 2018 and even more this year. This is a pretty stunning development. Turkmenistan, troubling country, but nevertheless huge potential, has vast gas and solar potential, could also expand its domestic consumption of clean energy and boost its own energy imports, all to the good of its own people. Unfortunately, the government hasn't been looking that way. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have enormous hydroelectric potential, and if all goes according to plan, should in time be able to make a significant contribution to meeting large parts of their neighbors' electricity needs. This is not just an energy sector development, this is also an economic, a political development in that region for this kind of cooperation. Uzbekistan likewise enjoys vast wind and solar potential and plans to develop large-scale solar. Harnessing more of this clean energy could help it address the challenge of its declining gas production and growing energy demand while providing room for energy exports. All 5 Asian countries can likewise reap the benefits of economies of scale and closer trade relations to take advantage of the economic and environmental benefits that can be generated by a competitive Central Asian Regional Electricity Market, or CAREM. This is a new project that USAID has been working on, and we're seeing a lot of positive movement in that direction. The challenge for each country in Central Asia is to maintain or develop the soft infrastructure that will attract the long-term investment needed and drive down the cost of energy project financing. We should remember that Central Asian nations aren't just competing with their neighbors for investment. They're competing with Pennsylvania, Texas, and Guyana. And that's a tough crowd to compete with. The United States has partnered with Central Asian countries for nearly 30 years and looks forward to maintaining these partnerships for many decades to come. The Central Asia region has enormous energy potential, not just gas and oil, but solar, wind, hydro, huge potential. Improving Central Asia's soft infrastructure is the best path to develop these resources, which will bring prosperity, job growth to the region, while helping each country to meet their economic, social, and national security goals. The United States looks forward to providing the political and technical support and to facilitating the commercial partnerships that will help Central Asian countries achieve these goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I would like to open the floor for some questions. Generously accepted to have some minutes for a Q&A discussion before we move to the panel. So I would like to invite, please if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, Stephen Blank, American Foreign Policy Council. The domestic obstacles in Central Asia in terms of soft infrastructure are well known to people who study the region. But it seems to me that apart from those, there are issues of an external nature that also impinge on these countries' ability to move forward and cooperate, say, with the United States or potentially with the European Union. For example, I don't see that Russia and China are Russia's certainly not investing in any of these alternative forms of energy, and neither of them have any interest in reforming governance. I don't see a lot of renewable energy projects in the Belt and Road Initiative either. So is that an obstacle as well?
Yes, absolutely, it's a huge obstacle. Russia wields enormous influence in Central Asia because of historical ties and for other reasons. They're good at coercing behavior from governments and officials. China, with the Belt and Road, has rolled out this tremendously appealing paradigm, which we think, as the U.S. government, runs contrary to sound economic development in these regions, not just in Central Asia, but in other areas where China has rolled out this plan. It doesn't, in our view, lead to sustainable, positive economic growth, the kind of economic growth that leads to sustainable economic development, to the kinds of development of social, of government, of public services, those kinds of things. And so it's a huge obstacle. And the amount of money that China can wield to attract governments to sign up for this program are enormous. So this has always been a little bit of an obstacle in American foreign policy. We don't go out and bribe people to sign up for our programs. We don't use the kind of backhanded coercion. We don't have the debt trap that the Chinese have exercised so effectively in places like Africa. We have to sell our story on the basis of our values and how it is effective. So that's why something like the soft infrastructure we're talking about today is so important. Because until you tackle the inefficient governance in the region, until you tackle corruption, until you energize an NGO sector to hold governments accountable, to point out flaws in the system, you're not going to see the kind of growth that these countries need. And the evidence is in the last 25 years, it's been not the kind of growth that their potentials seem to show. There are tremendous resources in Central Asia. In a place like Kazakhstan, they've taken a lot of that money and put it into social services and public services and the like. But I think the potential is so much greater, even in a country like Kazakhstan. But certainly in the other countries of Central Asia, they have, in our view, underperformed. And there are real possibilities, real opportunities for the countries in the region to do better. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of the issues we've been talking about today, of the soft infrastructure, of getting the rules of the game right, to really unleashing the power of the private sector. And that's not just business, but that's also the civil society. You make a better state, you make a better society when you do that. And so, yeah, it's a huge obstacle to what we would like to happen in Central Asia.
Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Well, since you talked about Kazakhstan, I was wondering if you can talk more about bilateral trade relations between the two countries. According to the USTR, trade relations between the US and Kazakhstan were $2.1 billion in 2018. And US imports are overwhelmingly from raw commodities, oil, minerals, agricultural products. So what's needed for this trade relationship to go to the next level? Is it that Kazakhstan needs to improve their industry so they can actually produce more manufactured goods? The US is just not interested in Kazakhstani manufactured goods compared to other countries. What's missing for trade ties to go to the next level? Thank you.
For us, the primary question isn't how do we boost trade between the United States and Kazakhstan. That will happen when Kazakhstan is competitive in the markets that they produce in. What Kazakhstan needs to do first is to encourage the private sector to produce the kind of goods that are competitive in international markets, and then they'll sell everywhere. I mean, there's a natural issue of geography here. where Kazakhstan is about as distant of a country from the United States as possible if you're talking about transportation and the like. So it's not natural that our trade would be very high. It's easier to trade with closer neighbors. But Kazakhstan is a growing economy. They do have goods and services that could be very competitive in the US markets. But they have to understand how to compete in those markets. Governments can be helpful to their industries in doing that. The other side of it is Kazakhstan is in a trade relationship with Russia and Belarus, and Armenia, and I don't know who else is in Kyrgyzstan, yes, right. And that I think inhibits bilateral trade with the United States. They've committed to a trade partnership with countries that don't see the rules of the road exactly the same way we do. And I think that makes it a little more difficult for the kind of normal trade that will develop naturally.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. James Grant. I'm actually going to be on the panel in a minute, but while we have you here, I have a question. You rightly mentioned that renewables are an important pillar of energy security, along with diversity of supply, diversity of supply routes. And you can certainly make that argument for energy buyers. But if you're an energy seller, supplier like in Turkmenistan, like in Kazakhstan, how do you sell renewables to them? Because obviously exporting electricity isn't as simple as putting it into a barrel, right, and putting it on a truck. So how do you make the case for renewable energy for some of these energy producers that make their bread and butter off of selling oil and gas?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is it's just a matter of the bottom line. If you produce energy for domestic consumption without using up the oil and gas that you can sell on international markets, you're going to make more money exporting that oil and gas. So it just makes sense from that bottom line standpoint. But we all recognize that we have climate change issues that need to be addressed. Countries in that stage of development are dealing with issues of pollution. And so to clean that up, there are clean energy technologies that make a lot of sense for any country at any level, at any stage of their economic development, to really look at them, because we're at an era now where these clean technologies are very price competitive with traditional hydrocarbons. And so it just is prudent for a country to look at those as options. Where are you going to put your emphasis? Where are you going to put your public investment? Where are you placing your bets? And I think renewables in any country should be a part of that mix. Now, it's up to each individual country to decide what that mix is, what makes more sense. And as in the case of Kazakhstan, a country that is, has enormous hydrocarbon resources, they'll look at it differently than a country that doesn't have those and is paying precious money to import energy every day. Kazakhstan doesn't have quite that difficulty. But I think what strikes me is just looking at the United States, the growth of renewable energy in this country is really astonishing. And this is happening at the same time that we're, as I just pointed out, this amazing growth of oil and gas production in the country. So we're exporting these resources now. So in an open market economy like ours, thousands and thousands of decision makers are making that same decision of what our energy mix will be as a country. And a number of them are putting money into investing in renewables. And we depend on the market to fundamentally make these kinds of decisions. And in our own market, which is a quite free and open market, these decisions are creating a new energy mix in the United States.
Thank you so much for coming and participating in our event. I'm Mario Cohen with the International Tax and Investment Center. The Russians and the Chinese just inaugurated our Siberia main gas exporting pipeline. We have a piece in Forbes today about that, thanks to my team here, James and John Badkin. What is the next big project in energy for Central Asia? Are we still in an era that a big pipeline, maybe Lisa Curtis and I wrote a piece about TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, right? Pipeline many years ago, and there's some developments, but not a lot. What about the Turkmenistan-Azerbaijan gas interconnector? Where are the markets that can be supplied with available resources, as you mentioned? Central Asia is blessed by hydrocarbons. Kazakhstan has uranium and coal. Where can that energy go?
Well, the quick answer is a lot of that energy still can go to Europe. So the gas that's filling the southern gas corridor is, it's going to dry up at some point. So we need new sources for that gas. And one of those, the obvious one, would be Turkmenistan. Those of you who have dealt in Central Asia for the past 10 or 20 or 30 years understand that, we go down that road and it looks like Turkmenistan might really be interested in somehow connecting up and exporting into Europe. And then it all stops. And then a few years down the road, the idea gets some wings again, and there's some optimism, and you get oil companies and governments out there talking to the Turkmen, and then it stops. So we're in another period of right now where there's some more optimism about this. So I'm not going to say that this time is going to be like all the others and it won't work, because we have to be somewhat optimistic, because it makes a tremendous amount of sense. It makes sense for Europe. It makes sense for the nations of the Caucasus. It makes tremendous sense for Turkmenistan. But the leader of Turkmenistan has a different calculus about the benefits of this than we do. So yeah, there are projects there that have been ready to go for a long time. We still continue to support the TAPI pipeline, but you don't have to be an expert in energy to understand that there are a tremendous amount of obstacles in the way before that will be realized. And that's been the case for however long the idea has been out for 10 years at least. Other projects, there's certainly growing demand for energy in South Asia. I am not going to stand here and tell you that you can build a pipeline or some other thing, but I think that there probably are some creative solutions out there if the politics would allow that to go forward. Right now, I think there are too many political obstacles in the way for something like that to look realistic, for something for the international oil companies to place large bets, to invest their money in those kinds of projects. But there's certainly a lot of potential there. And at some point, it's going to happen. But a lot of what happens in Central Asia is unfortunately dependent on politics. And as I pointed out, this CARIM, this regional electricity grid, is a tremendous development. Something that I don't think any of us would have thought had a chance not that many years ago. But the politics in Central Asia are changing in ways that make this more of a possibility. And that will be a tremendous development in that region, not just in energy terms, but also in political terms of integration and cooperation. So I think there are all sorts of possibilities. Certainly, the Central Asians have got to be looking at bolstering their relationship with China, huge energy consumer. We tend to be a little bit skeptical of those agreements, wondering what's behind the agreement and what's the real cost of these projects. But nevertheless, in purely energy terms, it makes a lot of sense. You've got tremendous resources in Central Asia, and you've got growing demand in an enormous economy in China. But that goes for all of Asia, actually. The energy demand throughout Asia is going to grow. South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia is going to grow tremendously. And getting the energy needed to maintain that growth is a real challenge going forward for the next couple of decades. And Central Asia can play an important part in that.
Good. Last question. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Mark David Miller, Trade Bistro Advisory. The CASA 1000 project, you talked about the potential as a model, since this is export of electricity, not something that could be thrown into a barrel. And not only export of electricity, like through the Niagara grid, but we're talking export of electricity from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan into Afghanistan and Pakistan, politically sensitive areas. How do you see that developing? I mean, this has been, I know people have been working on this project for 15 years. It looks like things are coming together.
Yeah.
And how do you see it developing? Do you realistically see this launching soon? And two, do you see this as a good model both in the region and other regions for exporting actual electricity?
So I have to confess that I'm not up to speed on CASA 1000, the most recent developments, but having served in Central Asia, it's been around for a long time, so I understand.
Basically, you look at the bottom of your desk.
Yes, that's right. It's a good idea. Again, it's one of these ideas of bringing the energy resources in Central Asia to South Asia. The added virtue from a U.S. government standpoint was the political benefit it brings of integration. But it also requires a level of political cooperation, which has made this project difficult. This has been a difficult project technically, no doubt about that, but it's also been a difficult project politically. Nevertheless, the advantages of realizing CASA 1000, I think, are really tremendous. And so we continue to support it. We continue to put the U.S. government behind it. Hopeful that it will come to fruition. We'll see the benefits of all this work. And hopefully that it can be an example of the kind of things that can be done. Now again, this took a tremendous amount of effort by the U.S. government and other governments. So this wasn't something that the private sector dreamed up on its own. This was something that took a lot of government support. Normally we don't advocate doing that. We like to see the private sector and countries decide on their own what kind of energy mix, what kind of suppliers they're going to use, and that kind of thing. But in this case, there were very important geostrategic reasons that the United States has pushed very hard on this project. And it would be great to see the benefits of this and then demonstrate that a project this difficult can be done, and demonstrate the benefits on both sides, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, delivering the hydropower, and the benefits to India and Pakistan of this energy coming to their countries. I mean, it would be an enormous win for us. Doesn't mean that the next project is going to look like that. Doesn't mean that the next project is going to have this kind of strong and long-term U.S. support behind it, or that it would need that. We're hopeful that this would demonstrate the potential for other projects like this that would be done on their own. But it is an important project, and it has been for a long time, and it would be great to finally see it come to fruition.
Yeah, Mr. Donnelly, I wanted to thank you for being here. It's a great honor for us to receive you, and we really thank you for finding time for sharing with us your expertise. So please join me in thanking you.
Very.
Now we would like to invite our four panelists to join us at the table. As you can see from the report and from what we have been discussing, we have been organizing this event in partnership with the Energy, Growth and Security Program of ITC, the International Tax and Investment Center, and I really wanted to thank them and the whole team for co-organizing with us this event. So we will now have a discussion on the report itself. We will first hear from the two authors. Our first presenter will be Ariel Cohen, who is the head of this Energy, Growth and Security Program at ITC, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a recognized authority on international security, energy policy, and a leading expert on Russia, Eurasia, and the Middle East. The second co-author of the report is James Grant, who is the program manager at the Energy, Growth and Security Program. He's a graduate from the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, and is also a junior fellow with the American Foreign Policy Council, working on global energy market, geopolitics, and US national security. We will then have two discussants. First, Daniel Witt, who is the president of the International Tax and Investment Center, who has been working to promote free markets and helping to lower the barrier to taxes, trade, and investment in transition economies for nearly 30 years. He has been among the first foreigners to discuss international tax and investment issues with the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, and Myanmar. And prior and assuming the duty as president of ITC, Mr. Witt was the executive director of the Tax Foundation, which is the oldest tax and budget research organization in the US. And then we have the pleasure to receive Ambassador Robert Chikuta, who has been ambassador of the US to the Republic of Azerbaijan until very recently, and who had a long and extensive experience at the top level US diplomats. He has positions including earlier at the US Embassy in Berlin and Tokyo. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in Albania and had other positions in Kabul, Vienna, Baghdad, Johannesburg, and Sana'a in Yemen. And is now also on the advisory board of the Caspian Policy Center, currently writing and consulting on international energy security, as well as on development in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So you can see a really impressive group of experts who are here today to present this report, and then we will after open the floor for a broader discussion. So Ariel, do I give you the floor to begin with your remarks on the report?
Thank you very much, Dr. Laruelle. I am delighted to be here at the Institute and at GW. I think the scholarship that comes out of here is tremendous. I also want to thank ITIC and the president, Dan Witt, for housing our program and allowing our work. And my colleague and co-author James Grant. Without him, we could not do the second report in the series of infrastructure development in Central Asia. As you may remember, our first report last year focused on hard infrastructure. Hard infrastructure are bridges, roads, airports, ports, fiber optics, etc. So these are the things that develop 21st century economy. And in Central Asia, you have a transition of initial Western investment after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where a lot of money went into oil and gas, to a modern infrastructure investment. A lot of that money comes from China. In the framework of the Belt and Road, there's some European money, EBRD is active in that part of the world, and some private sector funding as well. Unfortunately, the United States is not any longer at the forefront of infrastructure investment. We can address that in a moment. But this year, we moved on from talking about the bridges and the roads to talking about what makes this infrastructure actually function. Why is it that in some parts of the world, infrastructure investment is profitable, is transparent, is active, and in other parts of the world we have less success, and I would also count our United States as part of the world where we have a scarcity of infrastructure investment, but this is not the topic of our report. So we identified a number of soft infrastructure functions that are necessary in order to have a successful push. And the amount of money Central Asia requires is for development of infrastructure going forward is in tens of billions of dollars. And if you don't have the framework, if you don't have the laws, the regulation, the civil service, the supervisors, the regulators, you will have a lot of problems going forward. So if you look at such basic parameters as GDP per capita, as GDP total numbers, you will see that from Mongolia to Azerbaijan, you have a leader in GDP per capita, that's Kazakhstan. You have a leader in total GDP, that's also Kazakhstan. You have Turkmenistan with relatively few people, but also with a huge GDP. But as Ambassador Connolly mentioned before, there are a lot of issues that Turkmenistan presents. So we looked at the factors that contribute or slow down the investment. One is private sector and the competition in the private sector. To what extent the private sector can be the mediator of resources to put in infrastructure development? What do you need by that? What do you need for that? And how the private sector interacts with the government and with the regulators. So this is an important issue. In a place like Turkmenistan that I just mentioned, in my personal opinion, the government is too actively trying to regulate everything. And the private sector is not feeling free to make its own investment decisions. In Uzbekistan, on the other hand, there is progress. After the Mirziyoyev administration took over in the aftermath of the death of Islam Karimov, they're trying to open the country up. They made the currency convertible. They improved the visa regime so more investors and business people can come and check things out. But we're not there yet. In Kazakhstan, on the other hand, there's a track record of private sector being actively involved in a number of things, including infrastructure, including energy services. So for those of you who visited Kazakhstan, you saw the amazing progress of that country in the last 30 years. I first started traveling there probably close to 30 years ago. So yes, there is a lot of progress, but when we're comparing the necessary investment in Central Asia as a region to, let's say, East Asia or Europe, you see that there's a lot of room for growth. One of the important pillars of this regime of infrastructure, soft infrastructure investment regime is fair and effective tax regimes. My colleague Daniel Witt, the president of ITIC, has a lifetime of experience, and he probably is going to address that. But it's a simple thing. If a business feels that it's taxed to death, it's not going to make the necessary investment decisions to come to your country. The tax needs to be predictable, needs to be transparent, and the enforcement needs to be consistent. Without that, it chokes the investment and it chokes the business. Another thing, good governance. That sounds kind of vague, but we all know that good governance means that the government officials make substantive decisions based on fair and transparent criteria. It means that if a decision is made that someone is not comfortable with or it affects their business, there are ways to appeal both administratively and legally. That the administrative law is not only on the books, but also in courts and is being enforced. And this brings me to a discussion of the rule of law. The rule of law is an extremely important factor in all transitional economies, and for that matter, in the developed West, in our country and elsewhere. And in Central Asia, one of the bright lights in terms of the rule of law is the introduction of the English law for now in one particular environment. And I'm talking about Astana International Financial Center. They, through the legislation and constitution, are now allowing dispute resolution with English law being applied by English and other adjudicators. So it's a court or arbitration. You have a choice. You can write it into your contract. Increases your transparency, predictability, and eventually probably will result in Astana International Financial Center hosting an international arbitration facility comparable with those elsewhere. Stockholm, of course, the litigation capital of the world, London, and elsewhere. The idea now is to take that experience, they'll run it for probably 5 years, and start moving it outside of Astana International Financial Center, outside of that particular futuristic-looking building, kind of looks like Epcot Center in Disney, and apply it elsewhere through Kazakhstan. A very interesting idea. They're not alone doing that. If you look at Dubai, if you look at Abu Dhabi, they are also moving in that direction. And the chairman of the court, if I remember his title correctly, is a former British Chief Justice Lord. So the man who ran the whole British justice system was in the top British court is the chairman of that court, Lord Wolfe. So moving along, how much time do I have? A few more minutes. Moving along, an important piece of our report is looking at public-private partnerships. This is very, still managed, don't worry. Private-public partnership, PPP, is the ability of a government to shift risk for a long-term project in hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to the private sector while providing the necessary support for a project to be implemented. Good examples are major roads. I was recently in Moscow. I think it's a public-private partnership, I'm not sure. The new toll road between Moscow and St. Petersburg that didn't exist for the duration of Russian history. There was always a struggle to just drive from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Now they got it. Other roads, railroads, airports, and ports can be executed by private sector putting money. The returns are not very high, but they're secure, and there's a good cooperation between the private and government organs that are developing these projects. And Kazakhstan, again, is a leader, the only one with the laws to implement that. The supporting regulation is not fully developed yet, but they're aware of that and moving in that direction, whereas other countries in the region are still struggling with developing the necessary laws and implementing the regulation for PPP, for private partnership. The last thing I want to say is the importance of personnel, of human resources. Professor Larwell and I just chatted about it before the conference started. You see that it requires a certain mindset and certain education and certain practice. And again, with the Bulge program, Kazakhstan did a lot to send young people abroad, educate them, then they come back. Some of them rose to be deputy ministers, and probably I think there's one or two ministers who were Bolshevik graduates. A country making an organized effort to send its best and brightest, select it through competition, and then encourage them to come back. That's a big deal. India and China now are also encouraging a lot of expats to come back, but it's less organized and less orderly than Bolshevik. The Uzbeks tried, I think in the early 90s, to send hundreds of people out, and at some point Islam Karimov didn't like the ideas these people, young people, brought back. He wasn't comfortable with that. Some of them were radicalized in places like Turkey in terms of religious education. Some of them had democratic ideas, so it wasn't comfortable, and I think he put a kibosh on that. You cannot move forward in history without bringing technical knowledge, but also other ideas and education back to your countries. With all my loud and nasty criticism of Russian imperial policies in Central Asia, you must recognize the educational and cultural function that the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union played in developing the intelligentsia and the technical class in Central Asia that before that was heavily Islamized and sort of, did I say backwater part of Eurasia. Today, of course, the situation is radically different than it was 150 years ago, but again, a lot of work needs to be done. We at ITIC recently hosted a number of bright, young Kazakh students, graduates of Nazarbayev University and other universities, and it makes a lot of difference, especially if these people don't manage to find jobs in the United States and have to go back home. I'll stop here.
All right, thank you very much. Just quickly, a thank you to Dr. Laruelle, Central Asia Program, Jeanette, for all their support in organizing this and co-hosting. I'd also like to thank some of our interns who worked on this paper, and without their diligent research would not be possible. One of them here with us, David Pasmanik. Thank you. And John Bachan. David, make sure your phone is on, please. Thank you. And it was, of course, a pleasure and honor working with Dr. Cohen on this report. So at the risk of being redundant after Dr. Cohen's comprehensive speech, I'll be brief. I'd rather be brief than redundant. As was said, soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure are two sides of the same coin, right? These are the keys to unlocking economic development. One cannot exist without the other. We know that Central Asia is endowed with a wealth of economic potential, and I think a shallow perspective would say that most of this is their role as a transit country connecting Eastern and Western markets. Obviously, this will be a boon to their economies, but if you look at the Central Asian countries themselves, there's a wealth of natural resources and human capital. Kazakhstan's a country of 18 million, I believe Uzbekistan's almost twice that, 32 million people. And these are people that are increasingly becoming more educated. So there's a wealth of resources and economic opportunity in Central Asia, but Central Asia does need to still shake off its Soviet legacy of remittances and commodities and extractive-driven economy, and to try to shift more towards services and manufacturing. And I think that's a lot of what soft infrastructure is about. It's making the economy more resilient, more flexible. If you take Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan, you're talking 25% to 40% of GDP is through fossil fuel sales. I believe Turkmenistan is China's #1 gas supplier. So what you have in effect, these countries have benefited from high oil and gas prices over the past decade, but over the past few years, those prices have gone down.
and all of a sudden you have these countries a little worried because especially Turkmenistan is sort of a one-trick pony, right? So you need to be able to diversify your economy away from fossil fuel sales, and you cannot do that without considerable investment in soft infrastructure. I have a couple interesting tidbits here. So the past 10 years, Central Asian republics have received about 120 billion in foreign direct investment, which FDI is usually a pretty good litmus test of your competitiveness as a country. Do countries want to invest in you? Do they want to start projects in your country? Of that 120 billion, Kazakhstan has received 70%, Uzbekistan 18, Turkmenistan 12, and it sort of trails off with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Of that 70%, 55% of the FDI in Kazakhstan has gone to oil and gas projects. Uzbekistan, 40%, Turkmenistan actually much higher. When you look at FDI in telecom, finance, trade, those are 9% of foreign direct investment compared to worldwide closer to 25 or 30% is the average for these sectors. So if they can go ahead with some of the suggestions that we posited in the report and open up transparency, promote these PPP laws and projects, arbitration, open up the banking sector to private sector competition. Uzbekistan's banking sector is 85% run by the government. So we need to see these countries start to open up their state-owned enterprises and make room for the private sector. I think with that, I'll hand it over to Daniel Witt.
Well, thank you. And Marlene, thank you for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here at your center at GW, and we have the Mutual Admiration Society. But quickly congratulate James and Ariel, and again, we are so happy that your program is a part of ITIC. It's serious research. You take this report, you take the piece we did a year ago, you did a year ago. I think those two pieces together are some of the most comprehensive research on Central Asia and economic development. And I think it's important for us to pause here as we talk about infrastructure, whether it be soft or hard, that it's all about development. And that comes down to improving the quality of life and the standard of living for the people in Central Asia. That's the ultimate metric. And I look back at the first report this morning, and you detailed that enormous sums of money are needed to bring this part of the world up to a norm, to achieve the quality of life and the standard of living. I mean, enormous sums that are hard to get our hands around. But $33 billion a year up until 2030. And nowhere in our discussion yet have we mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. But we always think of Africa, maybe Latin America, but they're just as important to that part of the world. But the report makes crystal clear we need more than money, more than cement, pipes, cables. If we are to achieve, and again, what do we want to get us to this quality of life? It's a sustainable, inclusive growth. Not just a peak because you've got a big project coming in with perhaps Chinese or private sector investment, but growth, innovation, economic diversity, that will achieve and drive the prosperity. And it's the soft infrastructure which creates that framework. And I like to summarize it as legal, regulatory, and fiscal. Those are the three pillars of soft infrastructure. And this is where ITIC, why we were created, and what we've been working on since 1993. We kind of were in the right place at the right time. We helped Kazakhstan draft its first unified tax code. And that, you talk tax, it's going to put you to sleep, unless you're paying them, unless you're paying the taxes. But they threw out 56 Soviet laws and put in place one modern OECD-like tax code. That was a giant leap forward that happily was quickly copied. Earlier this year, ITIC was, not sure it was elected, named, appointed to be the first NGO observer to the Belt Road Tax Coordination Forum. And their ambition is to try to foster tax cooperation and coordination in a way like we see from Paris with the OECD or the IMF here in Washington. And it was interesting, when I was in China for that meeting, it was all about creating a growth-friendly tax environment. Where a week before, when I sat at the IMF and World Bank meetings, it was our corporations paying their fair share, and how can we squeeze more out of multinational enterprises. So is the glass half empty or half full? And these rules make a big, big difference. But it's not just the rules and the laws. I mean, how many countries can we think we've been in together? They've had great laws on the books, but they're not implemented. So this is where it comes down to, and I'm happy we talked about human capacity. It's capacity building. But soft infrastructure cannot be imported. You can transfer know-how. You can share it. But it must be institutionalized. It must be internalized. It's a culture. And for many of these countries, it's a fundamentally different way than they have been trained to think. And sadly, even after a generation of independence, those thoughts are still there. You know, to think about transparency, level playing field. I mean, I'm comfortable with BRI and money coming from China if it's on the terms of a level playing field. And all of us should be. And you know, back to this culture, it's getting government out of the way. Not what government can do, but how can government stop imposing obstacles? This is a culture that is needed to foster and reward innovation and risk-taking. Without that, you're going to have a hard time seeing progress. Now, the quick review of data James and Ariel shared makes me quite positive. You know, post-crisis, these countries in Central Asia have moved forward quite nicely. So I believe the future is bright. Number two, there's a pot of money there, $1 trillion of Chinese money for development that is there, whether we like it or not. And we have to look at this with our eyes open. As I said at a meeting a couple weeks ago, you know, we all know the risks of debt traps, but countries get in debt traps. Look at Argentina without much money from China. So those are risks that are there with or without China. But we have to look at how this money can be utilized in a transparent way, in a way that is fiscally manageable, in a way that is a level playing field, so an American contracting company can have the same opportunity as a Chinese contracting company. Those types of things I think are very important. You look at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Again, whether America likes it or not, it's a player. It's there. And the British, the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Italians, the Austrians were all founding members of that institution. And it's interesting, you go to Beijing, for those of you who have walked around the corridors of the World Bank, you're going to see a lot of your old friends there in Beijing who have hit the compulsory retirement age of the World Bank, which I believe is 60. They're living quite happily. But what they are doing is they are exporting the best practices, the procurement practices, the transparency practices. So we should be colorblind on the source of development in infrastructure capital if the frameworks and the rules and the mechanisms are in place. So I'm quite optimistic about the future as long as these mechanisms for soft infrastructure are put in place. Because history has proven over and over again, everywhere in the world, if you have a competitive tax regime, and Ariel's talking like a tax guy, stable, predictable, transparent. If you reduce the government bureaucracy, cut the red tape. And thirdly, we haven't talked about it yet, but respecting property rights. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the 3 pillars of soft infrastructure that will attract investment and deliver prosperity and growth for the people.
Thank you very much. And I also want to congratulate Ariel and Peter on excellent work. This is important because in many ways, we've talked a lot about this, and I agree with whatever we've said so far, but I'm going to try to draw this out in some different ways. And by the way, I also want to say thank you very much, and I sort of feel like I'm finally working, because I've often snuck into these sessions in the back of the room and listened, so it's about time you maybe do something, earn my keep. But I want to do a couple things on this. I agree with what we've been talking about so far. We can talk about a soft infrastructure or market-based reforms. These are key. You can build something, but it's got to work, and we're talking about how it works. Now, I think one of the things which I've noticed in this report, which is good, because one of the things with the infrastructure development is, if you look at the infrastructure in Central Asia, it's traditionally been oriented towards Moscow. What's happening now is the construction, and this is in the reports both this year's and last year, is moving east-west, taking advantage of the economic realities out there, which is huge economy on the western half of Eurasia and growing huge economies on the eastern, and also, don't remember, the southern half of Eurasia. India is also important in this process. The question becomes, how do these countries take advantage of it? Now, if you're sitting in the capitals in that region, as Kurt talked about earlier, the United States is literally half a world away. Figure it's 11 hours time difference, that's telling you something. Okay, that's to Washington. Keep going west. Okay, let's go further. Who do these countries turn to? And one of the points that I would sort of make here is that I agree, while the soft infrastructure has got to be developed locally, it is going to be, to a certain extent, imported. Because they're going to be looking to examples. They're going to, when they make a trade deal, when they make an investment deal, when they make a loan deal, whose rules are they working from? Are they working from, basically market-based Western models, the systems we've set up over in the IMF and the World Bank, the US, or are they working from something else? Something else which can lead to a situation which may seem advantageous at the moment, but down the road isn't. And I think as Ariel noted earlier, I mean, other countries have gotten themselves into debt traps without sort of malicious efforts by foreign governments. But those governments are going into these situations because they need the money. They need to develop. Where is it coming from? And one of the things which I think, looking at the 2 reports, what I would like to suggest before we get to a discussion is more of a kind of a literal merging of the 2. But there's a great line in the new study, talking about problems in the region, high transportation costs due to long distances, okay, got that, extended delays at border crossings, corruption, flawed legal framework, and limited access to global markets. But wait a minute. We're talking about building a road, we're talking about building a railroad. We look at I'll take the Baku-Tbilisi Paris Railroad, which ends at a lot, and then crosses system now for crossing the Caspian up to Aktau and Turkmenbashi. Okay, you got a great railroad that goes across. Went on a ship. Great new ferries to get it across. Railroads in Kazakhstan, I understand, not bad. Railroad in Turkmenistan, I understand you can't go over 25 miles an hour. Problem. Every one of those borders presents a potential for corruption. Bakshish, Azerbaijan has tried putting their custom systems on electronically. how do those work? Are they compatible? Because every time you have a little bit of friction, you have a potential for worse corruption and also slowing things down. Now this is where I'm kind of coming in with this idea, maybe you can import some ideas for soft infrastructure. Because let's remember Europe. I will tell a personal story. When I studied as a student in Salzburg many years ago, it took me 25 minutes to cross the border between Berchtesgaden and Salzburg. Yeah. Oh, by the way, you also got to change money. Now I realized it was somewhere after the Paleolithic, but none of us in the room can remember actually having to do that.
But you didn't have to change SIM cards at that point.
Yeah, that's true. It was cheap because you could make a phone call. But again, you look at the tier system and things like that, there are ways that countries have developed to improve the customs systems, to improve the transportation across, make it more efficient. And with these things, the electronics are also sort of on our side. How do we do that? How do we get these governments to adopt new systems that will improve things? I would argue that frankly, the desire for development, the desire for economic expansion provides us an avenue to do so. I often found in my discussions with governments in the region, if you talk to them about good governance, they'll be, you might get polite response, you might just get, you don't know what you're talking about. But if you want to get investment in the country, you're going to have to have rule of law. You're going to have respect for property rights. You're going to have a clear, transparent, predictable tax regime. And this is an avenue for moving forward. During my time as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Energy, one of the things I found was geology was not enough. You could have great rocks, but if the situation above the ground wasn't good, you were not going to get that investment. And I can tell you some G20 countries who lost out on major investments by US oil companies just because it was so friggin' difficult to deal with their government, and you have no idea from one minute to the next how you're going to get taxed and how you're going to be able to move your money out. These are lessons that need to be reinforced in the region. One of the things which I think that the US government needs to be doing here is be active in helping bring this story to governments. Pontifications from government officials aren't going to necessarily work, but bringing along US companies will. And sitting down as part of the trade talks, as part of our trade delegations, as part of our daily diplomacy with these governments, on helping them understand how their development of this soft infrastructure, how their internalization of this soft infrastructure is going to help them develop. One final thing I would say, while we talk a lot here about foreign investment, don't forget about domestic development. These same conditions are crucial for keeping the money in these countries and growing their economies. And in that context, I would also urge dialogues between governments and stakeholders, and that includes companies, that includes the local chamber of commerce, the local American whatever chamber of commerce. This is all way of moving forward, but it's going to require consistent engagement on the part of the United States, on the part of other governments, to sort of help these countries realize that this is their way forward.
Well, thank you so much for this really interesting insight. I think there would be a lot of discussion going on, and I would like now to open the floor for that. Let me begin maybe by asking the first question. Many of the elements you mentioned in the report have been discussed for the region since the 90s. So what do you think now is the time to come back to that? Do you think that something changed either on the domestic scene in the region or on the international scene that make that now what you are saying can be heard more by the regional elites than it was like before? And I would like to open with that kind of broad question.
That's an excellent question, Marlene. Thank you. And I think something did change. And what changed is the spirit of cooperation and coordination in the region. And we saw just on the 29th of November, the five regional countries summit in Tashkent, a year and a half after the first one in, I believe it was still Astana. And this is a consultative summit to move forward. And all the players understand that they are in a precarious geostrategic location, that China is developing and has far-reaching ambitions, has money, has economic power and attractiveness. Russia is working hard on consolidating the Eurasian European Union, the CSTO, the Commonwealth Security Treaty Organization Summit was just the day before in Bishkek that President Tokayev of Kazakhstan represented his country there, and the first President Nazarbayev represented his country in Tashkent. So the countries understand that the sum total of them is bigger than each individual one separately. And this is a time for them to work together on legislation, regulation, taxation, and what's very important when goods and services are moving, customs, railroads, air traffic. Now you have more flights regionally between the capitals and other cities than you've ever had before. That's very important. And another thing, I think, who said that nothing concentrates your attention on the barrel of a gun?
Samuel, it's the prospect of being hanged in the morning.
Okay. Well, we will not know. That's a different quote, Steve. Don't confuse me. So I don't say that Afghanistan is the barrel of a gun, but as the United States is negotiating its withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Trump just recently visited there, and the talks with Taliban are restarting. The countries in the region understand that their coordination is more important than ever. Not just to find the right balance of multi-vector policy vis-a-vis Russia, China, the EU, and the United States, but also how they deal with a potential threat from the South. And that is also extremely important in creating this new atmosphere and awareness of the need to cooperate more.
If I can jump on that, I totally agree with Ariel, so I would add one other thing to this. One of the things many of these countries face is a youth bulge. I think it's in Azerbaijan, it's like 2/3 of the population was born in 1990 or later. Kazakhstan, I heard, is 60% of the population was under the age of 40. They got to find jobs. And at the same time, there's a desire to particularly in the energy-rich countries, to diversify away from oil gas production. Oil and gas is great, it provides a lot of money, it does not provide jobs. It's about as capital-intensive a sector as you're going to get. And the governments realize that. So in that sense, in terms of trying to attract foreign investment, trying to diversify their economies, this also provides a sort of, like a better term, teachable moment that we can maybe make some of these changes, which are right, we have been talking about since 1991, 92.
Just to tack on, I think the Tashkent Spring in 2017 is a pretty important recent development with Uzbekistan's opening up market liberalization and democratic reforms. So that's certainly noteworthy. And also to tack on to what the ambassador said, commodity prices are not what they were 10 years ago. They're quite depressed, and when I hate to beat this dead horse, but when your economy is so dependent on the export of commodities, that's going to add an extra sense of urgency to reform, I think.
Sebastian?
Thank you very much. Sebastian Jones, I'm a research professor working on Central Asia here at the Central Asia program. So thank you very, very much for this very interesting report. I read it. I really liked it. And as you mentioned, as you said, and this was mentioned by the way by Mr. Witt, something which was really striking to me is that Central Asia, as you write in the report, would require close to 33 billion in annual infrastructure spending through to 2030 to meet development needs. So this means that Central Asia needs tremendous foreign investments. And the question is now, who is going to finance that? Well, not the US, not the European Union, certainly not Russia due to the economic crisis, and this economic crisis is not over, it will be over. We know that Russia withdrew from several investment projects in Central Asia, especially from Kyrgyzstan. You might have the World Bank or some international organizations like the World Bank or the ADB, which might fund part of that, but not all of that, because they have plenty of other sectors to support. So here comes China. And China, which role has been growing for more than 15 years now, and it plays an essential role in the region. It's one of the main, or even sometimes second main economic partner. So my question is, how do you assess the impact of China on corruption in Central Asia? You mentioned very rightly in your report that corruption is one of the biggest issues in the region, and we have actually plenty of evidence showing how China uses corruption to get contracts in Central Asia, not only Central Asia, by the way, but by corrupting local governments, by corrupting administration. So, at a time when China is becoming the first investor in the region and might remain the main investor in the region, to what extent do you consider that China can be an obstacle to fight against corruption in the region? And I'm asking this question because you explain in your report that Central Asian governments take measures against corruption. But the question is, to what extent these measures are really materialized? I mean, there would be a lot to discuss about that in Central Asian countries, which are all neo-patrimonial states. And meaning that corruption means regime security. And, okay, all right, let's stop here. I have a question, I'll stop here, okay.
I think there may be an opportunity, and I remember saying this back in the 90s as we struggled to get market access for US companies in Russia and to try to change the Russian behavior. And I always thought by Russian companies partnering with Shell, ExxonMobil outside of Russia, and then together they could work inside of Russia. So what you're seeing here is the internationalization, a big step forward of many of the state enterprises from China coming outside. And I think there's certainly been questionable behavior by many of those enterprises in Africa. We've done a lot of work in Mozambique, but if some of that anti-corruption enthusiasm that we're seeing from the leadership in China could be imposed as the rules in the conduct for the companies outside, that I think that this could, one, improve the projects in Central Asia by reducing, we're never going to eliminate, but by reducing the corruption, and then also have the positive effect back inside of China. We had our 25th working group meeting where we bring together dialogue with Ministry of Oil, Ministry of Finance, and oil companies and oil service companies. 10 days ago, we did the meeting in Dubai, and we had the Chinese CP, Chinese Petroleum Engineering and Construction Company. So its holding company is CNPC, but it's kind of like ENI and Saipem, the Italian model. And I was talking to their number 2 finance person who will be the chief financial officer. I said, well, do you have to do tenders? Do you have to compete for these projects when you're doing a pipeline or building a refinery for CNPC in Turkmenistan? And he said, yes, of course. I said, is it a foregone conclusion? Do you always win when you're competing for a CNPC or a CNOT project? He goes, no. Sometimes we lose out to Western companies.
Ooh.
And I said, and then he was also very proud that they have done work around the world for companies like ExxonMobil and Shell. And for any of you who have worked with these companies, you know how strict their procurement processes are. So I think these things and what they are held accountable for outside of China can change the way they behave and ultimately change the way they behave in China. I'm not looking at this with completely rose-colored glasses, it's not easy, but I think it's an interesting way to change behavior versus just going from the inside.
Sure. Alex Sanchez, still James Defense. Question about Kazakhstan. While we're meeting here in Washington, President Tokayev is just finishing a trip to Berlin.
Yeah.
He met with Chancellor Merkel, and also he spoke at the 28th Berlin Eurasian Club, especially to try to attract German investment to Kazakhstan, specifically for the agricultural sector and the digital industries. What is your opinion about this trip? Do you think that he has been successful? Will he be able to actually attract German investment, or is just Germany and Kazakhstan just too far away from each other geographically? Thank you.
I think so.
Kazakhstan has excellent relations with many EU members, and German industry, of course, is the strongest in Europe in terms of machine building, in terms of automotive, etc. So it doesn't surprise me that President Tokayev goes to Germany and strengthens the ties. I think that Germany, as the key country in the EU, is playing a great role, but will be playing a bigger role as Germany finds its foreign policy and defense policy strengths. And in that respect, I think there's a lot of business that Germany can develop. And I would add another thing. When the Soviet Union liquidated the autonomous German Republic on the Volga and exiled, a lot of the Germans ended up in Kazakhstan. So there's a lot of human connections between Kazakhstan and Germany, also because of that population. So I see it as a positive and logical development. And I hope President Tokayev will come and visit the United States in the future.
I would just add, sort of also having worked with Germany on these things, the Germans are very aggressive in terms of trying to expand their export markets. For many years, they were the largest exporter in the world. And so they see these as attractive markets. They are used to doing business in this part of the world, and they're aggressive on sort of pushing that. Certainly, they have strong capabilities in the two sectors you noted, both agriculture and in IT. So I can definitely see this is something moving forward, and either partners or competitors for U.S. firms.
Do we have more questions? No, if no more, then I would like to thank our four presenters, and I would like now invite you to join us for some lunch. But please first thank with me our speakers.
Martin, let's get a quick photo.
Yes.
Together.